1,000 years ago, this fertile valley was the home of the Anasazi Indians. The Anasazi were fabulously rich. They imported their food, developed advanced technologies, and constructed huge buildings. Some were 4 stories high and had as many as 600 rooms. The Anasazi seemed to have it all, yet only a few hundred years after the peak of their success, their society completely collapsed, leaving behind this ghost city and the puzzle of what went wrong. It's a story that's been repeated many times since the birth of civilization in ancient Egypt, in the Roman Empire, and in the former Soviet Union. It happened to the dinosaurs. An entire species that had survived the prehistoric mayhem suddenly vanished. Nobody really knows why. The same pattern seems to be repeated again and again all over the universe. Planets and stars emerge from a chaotic jumble of atoms, then there's a catastrophic explosion, and cosmic chaos returns. For 5,000 years, scientists have been trying to understand this constant natural cycle, the turmoil which leads to order that then turns into confusion all over again. In some areas, they've been relatively successful, but they can't predict the weather yet. They can't forecast the next earthquake. And they can't predict the next extinction, which might be that of the human race. Recently, scientists came up with the theory that the simplest of rules can set in motion wildly unpredictable events, and they called it the chaos theory. Now other researchers claim to have found another theory that explains how order emerges out of chaos, and they call it the science of anti-chaos. They say it could overturn most of present-day scientific thinking. Fish swimming around in a chaotic mass can instantly change into an organized school that behaves as if it had a single mind. Thousands of birds rise into the air in complete disarray. Then suddenly the random flurry of bodies and flapping wings becomes a graceful formation, swooping and wheeling with extraordinary precision. But what makes them do it? How do they suddenly become organized? High-speed film shows that the turning motion travels like a wave through the flock in about 1/70th of a second, much faster than a bird's reaction time. The question is, how does an individual bird know whether to turn left or to turn right? Some people still think it's telepathy, but mathematicians can now show that order does arise spontaneously out of such chaos. Each of these computer simulations is programmed to follow a few simple mathematical rules, and the result is surprisingly like the behavior of a flock of birds in real life. An organized pattern emerges spontaneously from the chaos. Patterns and structures are everywhere. They appear in the arrangement of atoms that form crystals. You can see them in the behavior of ants. There are patterns in all kinds of things. You can even see them in the rises and falls of the world's financial markets. But traditional scientific theories cannot explain why an organized structure can suddenly emerge from a series of chaotic events. Because when that happens, it breaks one of the golden rules of modern science, the second law of thermodynamics. The second law, also known as entropy, explains how things decay with time. As it gets older, the intricate structure of a plant's cells gives way to increasing disorder, and the greater the disorder, the more the original form disappears. Following the same rules, the universe as we know it is bound to go the same way. According to the second law of thermodynamics, when the energy in the stars and the planets is finally used up, they will disintegrate. Yet that's not what happens in reality. Somehow, as the universe moves towards its end, it continually creates new and interesting structures along the way. Scientists who rely only on the second law find it impossible to explain why. But those who study anti-chaos believe that one day they will discover how form and order can emerge out of total chaos.
If there's any one big question that complexity is trying to address, it's why is there something rather than nothing? In some ways, that's the ultimate question in science. Physicists for well over 100 years have been very good at understanding the universal tendency towards disorder and decay. It's often called the second law of thermodynamics, the increase in entropy. We look around and we can see very clearly that things decay, that iron rusts, that fallen logs rot, that temperature goes from hot to cold, things cool off. But at the same time, not only do fallen logs rot, but trees grow. If we look around, we see stars, galaxies, people, plants, animals. There's enormous amounts of structure in the world. It's almost as if there were a universal yearning towards order, almost a force towards order.
This could mean the second law of thermodynamics is wrong. It could mean, as some people claim, that physicists have proved that life can't exist. It could mean that, since life does exist, that something supernatural must be involved. My feeling is it's the interpretation of the second law of thermodynamics that's wrong. And that life is actually consistent with the second law, but that the kind of things it's doing are just not the sort of things the second law addresses.
Another fundamental law of science is the law of gravity, which was discovered by Isaac Newton 300 years ago. For the first time, it let scientists predict with accuracy the motions of all the heavenly bodies. Then Newton came up with his famous laws of motion, and people thought it would only be a matter of time before all the secrets of the universe were predicted, revealed, and finally understood. It didn't quite happen that way, so scientists continued the search for other simple laws to explain everything, which in time became the basis of all modern science. And some of them led to important breakthroughs. Biologists dug deep into living cells and at the molecular level discovered the double-helix, the code of life itself. Physicists smashed atoms to pieces and discovered the particles believed to be the building blocks of the entire universe. But in the process, researchers began to suspect that the scientific laws they were working with weren't good enough, because time and again they didn't answer all the important questions. The laws of Isaac Newton explained what are called linear systems, which means that for a given cause, there is always a predictable outcome. But when things get really complicated, Newton's laws don't always seem to work. For instance, they don't explain a system like the weather because it's too unpredictable. They call that an emergent phenomenon.
You have an emergent phenomenon when the components out of which a system is made have one kind of behavior, but the system as a whole shows a different kind of behavior, so that you cannot reduce the behavior of the whole system to the behavior of the individual components. In other words, you have a kind of irreducibility. And emergence refers to that kind of irreducible order that comes out of a complex system.
Chaos is something that seems to behave randomly, yet can be analyzed mathematically. This is chaos at work, the intricate shape of a fractal. The complex structure repeats itself on infinitely diminishing scales because a computer has been given some simple rules to follow. It's the discovery that this sort of thing can stem from a simple set of rules that's at the heart of the chaos theory.
The kind of thing where you can see chaos in action is a food mixer in the kitchen. The actual rules of a food mixer are very simple. You put the food in, you push the button, and little paddle wheels go round and round and round in circles. And you say, well, there's nothing very complicated about a food mixer. But actually there is. If somebody says, there is a particular grain of sugar in that food mixer, I'm going to press the button for 30 seconds and I want you to tell me where that grain is going to end up. It's very hard to answer that question. And this is the kind of prediction that science would expect to make.
Chaotic systems are everywhere in nature, from a single drop of water splashing on the ground to the behavior of large masses of water in swirling streams. Then sometimes a completely chaotic system suddenly and unexpectedly takes on form. Understanding that is to begin to understand what complex systems are really all about.
Chaos is one piece of the theory of complexity. In a sense, it's the first piece people really understood fairly well. And it's because, in fact, it comes from simple causes. If the causes are simple, you can put them on a computer, you can follow through what happens, and you can see, even if the results look complicated, you know where they came from. It's the other way around that's much more difficult. If the causes are very complicated, then you can't even get started.
In this laboratory experiment, 4 different chemicals have been thoroughly mixed into a chaos of red and blue molecules. Then the unexpected starts to happen. Gradually, the mixture starts to sort itself out. The red separates from the blue, and after a while, the billions of molecules in the mixture achieve an extraordinary degree of order. You wouldn't expect it to happen, and scientists believe it's the influence of anti-chaos. It doesn't just happen in the laboratory. You can watch the same sort of thing happening in nature. Here, millions of simple cells swarm in chaos, then for some reason organize themselves into a slime mold. Orderly patterns appear in the arrangement of molecules on a platinum catalyst. Because this tendency for order to appear out of chaos is common in so many systems, it could be that at the most fundamental level there are universal principles of organization at work in everything, from this computer simulation of a forest fire to the behavior of ants in a colony.
Now, for some time, it has occurred to a lot of scientists that ant colonies and the social insects generally have fascinating dynamic patterns of behavior that are somewhat reminiscent of the way minds behave. In other words, you have all these simple elements, the ants running about, doing their own thing, and out of that comes a particular kind of order. It's like neurons interacting, doing very simple things in the brain, but if you put enough of them together and have them interact in a particular way, you get the most extraordinary type of behavior coming out.
The mystery is that while individual ants seem to behave in a random manner, the community as a whole follows an organized pattern of activity. Every 28 minutes or so, they all stop at the same time, and when they start again, they all start together. Brian Goodwin decided to use a computer to work out why.
We tried to produce the simplest possible model that could account for this type of behavior. And so we developed a model in which ants were represented as very simple automata. So they were just interacting, they could move, and what emerged very quickly from this model was the fact that periodicities at the level of the colony suddenly appeared.
Brian Goodwin's mathematics also showed that if the computerized ants were allowed to interact and roam anywhere they wanted, eventually, just like real insects, the entire colony then adopted a regular pattern of activity and inactivity. They all rested at once, and they all worked at the same time. At first sight, the idea of order emerging from randomness seems unlikely. For instance, if a blindfolded person taps typewriter keys at random, what are the chances of a whole word appearing if the person doesn't know how to type in the first place? And what are the chances of the letters organizing themselves into, say, a play by Shakespeare? Most people would say pretty long odds. And supposing the experiment was run repeatedly, what would be the chances of the same play materializing again and again? As unlikely as it may seem, in nature, that kind of thing can and does occur. But does the theory of anti-chaos tell us why?
I became interested in anti-chaos on an intuitive basis. I wanted to understand the order of development, the way a fertilized egg develops into an adult organism, which is a most amazing process that nobody understands yet. You have to understand that one begins with a fertilized egg, the zygote, and it then goes through 50 or so cell divisions. And during the course of that, cells become different from one another. This is a process called cell differentiation. So that the beginning fertilized egg, the zygote, winds up making about 250 different cell types. Muscle cells, nerve cells, spleen cells, kidney cells, and so on. And it's quite clear that all of the cells in your body have the same set of genes, about 100,000 or so in us. Different cells differ because different genes are active in them. Being active means making an RNA molecule and making a protein. So liver cells make one set of proteins and kidney cells another. And one knew even then that genes turned one another on and off in some complex orchestrated dance. Anti-chaos from the outset was my intuition and hope, namely that one would find that the order that you see in development and cell differentiation is spontaneous and natural and rather inevitable, rather than being merely the improbable consequences of mutation and selection. If we want to think of the genome as 100,000 genes in some kind of network turning one another on and off, then there's no mathematical tools readily available to look at a system of that complexity. We're going to have to invent some new ones. The ones that I invented some time ago were based on thinking of a gene as just active or inactive, as if it were a light bulb, and its product molecule just present or absent, so also like a light bulb.
To make an array of lights behave rather like human genes, all that is necessary is to wire them up following simple rules. The result is called a Boolean network. In the most complicated version, each light is wired to every other by a switch which obeys a rule. The rule might be, an individual light will go on only if two others are lit. Incredibly, with only 200 lights in a network, it would take billions of times longer than the age of the universe to switch on every possible combination. Arriving at a predictable pattern of lights would be extremely unlikely. Yet though the green lights are flashing on randomly, the clusters of red show that some stability is being achieved. A Boolean model of the human genome would have up to 100,000 lights, and if they followed these rules, the chances are that life on Earth would never have happened. But by making a simple change to the way the lights are connected, so that each light is wired to only two others, things get considerably better, and something extraordinary happens.
The most stunning results happen if you build a network in which every light bulb has inputs from two other light bulbs. Even if you assign those connections at random, even if you assign the rule governing every light bulb at random. Such a mad scramble of wiring and logic nevertheless exhibits anti-chaos. This is order for free.
In the same way that a network of lights can mimic certain aspects of the human genome, more complicated systems can be studied by watching piles of sand form.
The sand pile model is a model of a large dynamical system which consists of many parts. Suppose you build the sand pile by dropping grains of sand one at a time on your desk. In the beginning, the pile will be flat and it will be near equilibrium. All the sand, grains of sand will be lying very low, and they won't see each other, they won't interact with each other. As you keep adding particles to the system, the heap will become steeper and steeper, and you will start getting small avalanches in the system. That means that the individual parts of the system start interacting with each other. And eventually, the avalanches will become bigger and bigger and bigger until you reach a critical slope where the system will not grow any further. And at that state, you have avalanches of all sizes. That means that the system interacts globally. What happens at one part of the heap can eventually affect what happens at any other part of the heap. We don't have separate grains of sand anymore. We don't have many distinct systems. We have only one pile of sand that form one big dynamical system.
Systems like this are all around. For instance, the extremes of weather, or the extinction of species, even wild fluctuations in the international currency markets, and many other phenomena.
Down to 30, Jeremy!
Think of earthquakes as being generated by pushing tectonic plates into each other. In the beginning, the system is at equilibrium, just as the sand pile is in equilibrium in the flat state. But eventually, as the tectonic plates keeps squeezing into each other, you get into a state that is further and further and further out of equilibrium. And again, the earthquakes then will become bigger and bigger and bigger because the forces will become bigger and bigger and bigger. And the law for the sand slides in the sand slide models is exactly equivalent to what is called the Gutenberg-Richter law for earthquakes. Namely, that every time you have, say, one earthquake of size 6, you have 10 earthquakes of size 5, and 100 earthquakes of size 4, and so on. And the sand pile model exhibits precisely this feature. So that gives an understanding of why we have this very peculiar law for earthquakes. Actually, what it means is that the crust of the Earth on which we are walking is at what we call a critical state. It's precisely as this sand pile when it's at this state where it can grow no further. So this is completely different from the usual picture that people have of what's going on around us, namely that we think of things as being in some kind of equilibrium, but nothing could be further from the truth.
If this view of nature is correct, then the whole universe consists of systems that permanently wobble between order and disorder, with anti-chaos maintaining the balance. That is why scientists are now saying that if we could only work out the rules, it would let us understand the complexities of the environment we live in. And by manipulating those rules, it might even become possible to glimpse the future, so the human race might have a chance to control its own destiny. As they evolve and compete for space, a stable environment emerges. And as the computer obeys the rules of anti-chaos, order arrives.
Perhaps the most profound problem in biology is how life itself started. Of course, nobody knows. There really are two broad views. One is that life is based on the special properties of the magical double helix that everyone knows about, either DNA molecules or RNA molecules. What I've wanted to find myself for years is a deeper grounds to think that life is, in a sense, an absolutely expected property of complex chemical systems. I want it to be the case, if you will, that we're at home in the universe, that life is spontaneous, natural, and almost inevitable. And I think that that's the case.
Most scientists agree that life on Earth started when the basic chemicals in seawater were sparked by violent charges of lightning. It was these which created the compounds that are the chemical building blocks of all living things. Anti-chaos suggests that it was no accident. In fact, it was inevitable that individual chemicals would eventually cluster together to become more complex.
let's imagine the buildup and behavior of the imagined primordial soup. Life emerged about 3.8 billion years ago, just 100 million years after the crust was cool enough to support liquid water. So we have to imagine that there were some organic molecules around, carbon, methane, and so on, carbon dioxide, methane, and so on, that were gradually built up into more complex kinds of organic molecules, creating this hoped-for primordial soup.
Kaufman's theory involves a well-known chemical principle in which a catalyst persuades two molecules to combine more easily than if they were left to their own devices. Many of the functions of living organisms depend on this process. But this alone is not enough to explain how all the necessary ingredients for life were formed in the primordial soup. That's why Stuart Kaufman has developed the idea of auto-catalytic sets. In this process, a catalyst produces a chemical, which then combines with another to make a new molecule. The process continues until the correct chemicals are present to make some more of the catalyst so that the whole process starts all over again.
If in fact life emerged as such collective auto-catalytic sets of molecules, then it would appear to be the case that the roots to the formation of life are much more probable than we've expected. So we might hope to find it, for example, on other promising planets and other solar systems. In effect, life is the consequence of broad boulevards of possibility, not back alleys of thermodynamic improbability.
But that doesn't automatically explain everything. For instance, it doesn't explain why evolution on Earth has produced relatively few distinct groups of life forms and why they all share so many common features. Because there's been a strong underlying pattern to all of evolution.
The question is, where does that order come from? Now, in the conventional view, that order is basically imposed by historical succession and by natural selection. So you have a process in which virtually anything is possible. You get random variations, and those structures which are useful, like the eye or the limb, the leaf, the flower, they are stabilized by natural selection.
It was Charles Darwin who worked out the theory of natural selection, and for a century, it's been the accepted wisdom. But if order can arise from randomness, is Darwin's theory really necessary?
What we see as the origin of this order, the eye, the leaf, the limb, whatever it may be, is the intrinsic dynamics of developing organisms as complex dynamic systems. And therefore, the emphasis is shifted from natural selection as an external force to the robust dynamics of development as the generator of these forms. For instance, the eye we see as a highly probable structure, something that once you understand the principles of development in vertebrates, you realize that eyes are virtually inevitable.
The study of artificial life, like this computer-generated amoeba, suggests that Darwin's theory of evolution may not be the whole answer. It may be that it's too complicated to explain how life on Earth, real or artificial, actually evolves. It could be just the result of following a few simple rules.
One of the things that we've learned in the last decade or so of the study of complex systems is that the most interesting complex behavior comes out of not incredibly complicated systems, but out of systems which are composed of relatively simple parts, but many of them that interact with each other in fairly simple ways even. As a consequence, many of our formal models, the mathematical and computer models that we use to study complex systems, involve simulating or treating mathematically very, very simple parts that interact with each other in the context of some environment. And one of the systems that's been used the most is something called a cellular automaton.
A cellular automaton consists of a grid of tiny squares that interact with each other. According to the rules they've been given, they form themselves into loops that continually reproduce themselves in such a way that once a loop has surrounded itself with copies, there's no longer any space for it to go on, so it dies.
as the process of reproduction continues, one ends up with an expanding colony of loops that's spread out throughout this two-dimensional cellular automaton universe, consisting of a growing reproductive fringe surrounding an ever-expanding core or central region of dead loops. But it was surprising that what I ended up with was something which is very reminiscent of the growth of, say, a tree, where the central core of the tree consists of dead cells, and only the bark and the layer right under the bark is alive, growing out and expanding. Or, for instance, the growth of a coral reef, where the outermost surface consists of living animals that are building their shells upon the shells of their dead ancestors.
If such simple rules can govern the creation of living things, could there be other equally simple principles influencing how the human race actually behaves? Rules that might explain why thriving economies go wrong and suddenly collapse? Could such rules even explain the bizarre goings-on in places like the world's stock markets, or shed light on the fluctuations in international currency markets that can change in seconds without any apparent logic? Conventional economic theories cannot account for that sort of behavior, but perhaps the patterns of anti-chaos can.
When you start to think from a complexity point of view, you begin to see the economy not as something that's static, that's reached an equilibrium, that's basically, in a sense, dead. The economy you begin to see as something that's always unfolding, it's always reforming new patterns, it's forming into, think of the cities out there, they're forming patterns of settlement. Those patterns form and reform over decades and centuries. So we're starting to view the economy not as a sort of static system that one can sort of study through a microscope like a dead specimen in a lab, but we're starting to see it almost as alive, something that's always unfolding, that's always changing, that is, in a sense, always evolving. And this point of view is starting to make us look at the economy very much as an evolving, complex system rather than a simple, static system.
An example of how unpredictable markets can be was the battle for customers between two video recorder systems in the late 1970s. Though Betamax was technologically slightly superior to VHS, buyers seemed to be opting for the VHS system. Economic theory predicts that Betamax's technological edge would eventually pull the market back into equilibrium as buyers turned away from the VHS system. But it didn't happen, and the eventual outcome simply flew in the face of all the economic theories.
When I realized that in economics you could have more than one solution to the same problem, this absolutely horrified me. And it horrified a lot of my colleagues and some of my former professors even. We were used to thinking in economics that there was only one solution to any given economic problem, at least that was the dominant mode of thinking, and that solution in some way we could prove was the best of all feasible worlds. That is, that this solution that you see out there that the economy has arrived at is the best of all feasible worlds that England could do at the moment. Yet, here was I and other people thinking this way, showing that for any given economic problem there might be more than one solution. There might be 2 solutions, there might be 100 solutions, there might be infinite number of solutions. That would mean, and this was the real horror of the whole thing, that would mean that we might have ended up with a solution that was not the best of all feasible worlds.
Brian Arthur has found that economies all around the world operate like the sand piles. They build towards a stable state, but their stability is maintained only by frequent major disturbances, the financial avalanches. They are permanently finely balanced on the edge of chaos. For the first time, the theory of anti-chaos provides clues to how the seeming chaos of the stock market actually works, and it's been turned into a computer program.
We've designed a system that predicts the behavior of financial markets. Works on a pretty simple principle. We go back through the historical record of financial data and we look for patterns in price movements and other factors that relate to economic markets. And we do a lot of tests to see whether those patterns reproduce. That is, do the patterns happen again and again? And are they statistically significant? And we use those patterns when they occur to predict markets. We get data feeds from all over the world, and our computers are looking at those data feeds all the time. They're looking for certain patterns. If a certain set of prices goes up, a certain other set of prices goes down, the computer makes a prediction about what the markets are going to do, and it does a computation to figure out what we should buy and what we should sell in order to make the most money based on those predictions.
This is a day order for Account Prediction Company to buy 50 September 92 IMM British Pound futures at market.
Just checking the British pound, stay with me. What's the British pound?
The mathematical tools that we were using developed out of the quest for finding order in chaos and for using that order to make better predictions. Even though chaotic systems are unpredictable over the long term, they're more predictable than traditional random processes over the short term. And we cut our teeth, as it were, analyzing systems that we knew were chaotic. It's not clear that that's really pertinent to the markets, but on the other hand, the techniques do seem to give us better predictive power. That doesn't mean the markets are really simple chaotic systems, but it does mean these techniques have value.
So far, the trading is not real. The system is only on trial, and the money they make is hypothetical. But the idea seems to work.
20 at 4. 20 at 4 working.
The success of our computer system would put us at the top of performance of people who are trading out in the real market. It's always a bit difficult because when you pick the winners retrospectively, you're picking out what might have just been somebody who got lucky. It's easy. If you take 5 years worth of trading, there's always going to be somebody that's had a run of good luck. But our results put us up near the top of that heap.
Perhaps anti-chaos can help us understand economies, but could it also save the planet? Here in the Arizona desert, where the ecosystem is delicately balanced, Tom Vallone is studying a plot of land which has been the focus of an unusual experiment for the last 15 years. The landscape is dominated by drought-resistant shrubs and scrubby vegetation. At the start of the experiment, several large square plots were fenced off. The fences were built to keep out a single species of rodent, the kangaroo rat, while letting all the other wildlife roam around freely. The effect after 15 years has dramatically transformed the land.
On the plots where we excluded kangaroo rats, 2 species of grass increased dramatically. One species increased 10-fold, the second species increased 3-fold.
These results were completely unexpected.
When we first excluded the kangaroo rats, I don't think we would have been able to predict that the vegetation itself would change within those plots. We made simple predictions about the response of other granivores like the ants, but at that time, 15 years ago, we had no idea that the removal of kangaroo rats would change the vegetation type on those plots.
Because ecosystems are so complex, they seem to exist at the very junction between chaos and anti-chaos. The smallest of changes can set off an avalanche of change that is impossible to predict. But the theories of anti-chaos could change all that by providing a formula that not only predicts events, but allows them to be controlled. The dream of mankind for thousands of years. Once, heavier-than-air flight was just a dream. Early attempts to build aircraft imitated the birds and were spectacularly unsuccessful. Then, scientists discovered the principles behind aerodynamics. By applying those principles, we've developed all kinds of aircraft designed for a host of specialized uses. Relatively simple linear systems like the dynamics of flight are easily controlled and understood, but complex nonlinear systems are a different matter altogether. For instance, we understand how rain clouds are formed and why rain falls, which is why for the last 30 or 40 years scientists have tried many times to make rain fall on areas hit by drought. They've sprayed chemicals into the atmosphere trying to turn water vapor into rain showers, but with very limited success. The nonlinear weather systems are still beyond our control and understanding. We've come a long way from blind belief that the world moves according to the whim of supernatural forces. In its place, science has provided fundamental laws that explain some of the things that go on in the universe. But some are now starting to think that in the search for simple rules, we may have lost sight of the real complexity and unity in the world around us. They believe that the theory of anti-chaos is the real key to the next stage of understanding. If they are right, one day we may be able to explain many mysteries and answer questions like why technologically advanced societies evolve and then just die for no apparent reason. And that might even mean that one day we'll finally achieve the dreams of scientists everywhere, the complete understanding of the laws that govern all of nature.